Happy Cruel Friday, Rock Creek Fellowship. Of course, I'm riffing with that introduction on another introduction, the one by T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, when he begins by saying, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of dead ground, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots out of spring rains. April is the cruelest month, he says. Is it because of the teeming life and the hopefulness that's roused within us, standing side by side with the terror of knowing, the memory of realizing that death still happens, that your back still has discs in it that are like dried out cornflakes, that you still encounter allergies that make your eyes water, and tragedies that make your heart sting. Hope is a stabbing thing. I think Eliot grabbed hold of that, and we are people of hope, but we live in the cruelest of times because we live as new creation people in the middle of a present evil age. Two ages simultaneously overlapping, and we live with a hope that cannot be dominated, but at the same time experience all manner of sorrows around us. You may remember the story or the scene where Delmer in Oh Brother Where Art Thou is roasting gopher for supper, and he asks Everett Ulysses McGill if he wants some. Gopher, he says. Gopher, he says. And Everett, of course, in his charming way, says, no, my dear Delmer, I believe that a third of a gopher would merely rouse my appetite without bedding her back down. Of course, that's the problem with hope, is that many kinds of expectations we have of what could be feel like it just rouses our appetites just enough, but doesn't bed them back down. They don't satisfy, they just wet. So we live in a cruel time, but we also live as people of new creation. And we're talking about that this week actually, as we continue through Galatians in this series called Leaning into New Creation. And I wanted to share with you very briefly 3 little anecdotes that I hope will be short from children who have helped us in this time where hope lives alongside the possibility for unrequited realization of those hopes. One comes from a little boy who had just read the book of Judges and told my Old Testament professor friend Scott Jones, and your elder at Rock Creek, he said, you know, Judges ends on a rather sour note. In those days, there was no king. This perceptive young man had realized a refrain throughout the book. There was no king, and each man did what was right in his own eyes. In the absence of a clear hope, in the absence even of kings, people will be relegated to worship of some thing or another. They'll worship movie stars or the rich or fashion models or famous people of some sort, or maybe just their own desires. We'll be led along by our own noses into a form of cruelty because we're not ever the authors of our best hope. But alongside that story of recognizing that without a king, you're left to your own devices and you're never really the guide to anything, says Augustine, but to your own destruction when you're left by yourself. There was another little girl who reflected on this. I found it in my notes from a while back. She said, you know, Jesus can beat all of the bad guys because he has lightning powers and sun powers and moon powers. And I thought, in this diminutive, squeaky-voiced, cute little girl, an enormous truth was lurking, and a vivid imagination was awakening. she recognized that she had a king, and her king was able to do something about this creation because he had sun powers, moon powers, lightning powers, and so there was not going to be any kind of enemy in any kind of territory on which we trod that was going to ultimately cause us any disturbance. That's good news in the midst of the cruelties we face. And lastly, in our worship on Sunday, you may have noticed as well a little 2-year-old girl being held by her mother as part of the gaggle of folk that we were welcoming into our membership, and they were taking their vows, tethering themselves to us and us to them by affirmative responses to the grace of God. And each time I asked a vow, as the grown-up said it, this little 2-year-old girl emphatically declared, I do, I do, I do. We are a community where children are learning in the midst of a cruel world how to live by promises. Promises they make, but more importantly, promises they make because they're responding to a king with sun powers and moon powers and lightning powers who will not leave us as authors of our own destruction, but has himself become the author of our best hope, because he knows we live in cruel times, that he aims to make all things new. Think about that today as you go out into the world, and perhaps carry with you this little sentence from the Apostle Paul. When that king got active in his life, he said the result was people saw his life and they praised God because of me. Why don't we make that a prayer today? That folks in cruel April times, with hope standing side by side with things that would knock hope right in the gut and take its knees out from it, that they would see us, our actions, our care, our generosity, our warmth, our integrity, and they would praise God because of us, even in the cruelest month of April. I'll see you on Sunday.